March 1953, London, a city still bearing the scars of war, where entire streets remained nothing but rubble and ash. In a cramped Victorian terrace house on Rillington Place, Notting Hill, police discovered 3 bodies bricked up behind the kitchen wall. 3 women, murdered, hidden in a makeshift tomb. But that was only the beginning. When they tore up the floorboards, they found another body. When they dug up the garden, they found 2 more. 6 corpses in one house. And the man who put them there had been living quietly, respectably, as a trusted neighbor for over a decade. But here's the truly monstrous part. 3 years earlier, another man had been hanged for murders he didn't commit. Hanged for killing his wife and baby daughter. The real killer? He testified against him in court. He watched an innocent man go to the gallows, knowing full well he himself had strangled that man's wife. The killer lived 1 floor below. And nobody suspected a thing. This is the story of how the British justice system executed an innocent man, whilst the real murderer walked free. This is the story of Rillington Place. 1946. The war was over, but Britain was broken. The bombs had stopped falling, but London was a wasteland of shattered buildings, emergency housing, and desperate poverty. Rationing was stricter than it had been during the war itself. Families crammed into whatever accommodation they could find, sharing kitchens, sharing lavatories, sharing their misery. Number 10 Rillington Place was one such house. A 3-story Victorian terrace, once built for a single middle-class family, now carved up into flats and bedsits. The plaster was cracked, the wallpaper peeling, the whole structure tilted slightly to the left, as if the building itself was exhausted. The ground floor flat was home to Reginald Christie and his wife, Ethel. Christie was 47 years old, a clerk at the local post office. Thin, balding, with small round spectacles and a toothbrush mustache. He spoke in a soft, educated voice and always wore a tie, even on Sundays. The neighbors considered him respectable. He kept to himself, didn't drink, didn't cause trouble. His wife, Ethel, was a quiet, nervous woman who seemed to shrink whenever her husband entered a room. Christie had a secret, though. A secret that lived in his mind like a coiled snake. He had an obsession. Women. Not in the way most men did, not desire in any ordinary sense. It was darker than that, colder. He wanted control, absolute control, the kind you only get when someone stops breathing. The first victim came in 1943, during the war. Her name was Ruth First, 21 years old, Austrian, a refugee from the Nazis. She worked as a nurse by day and sold herself on the streets at night because nursing wages weren't enough to live on. She met Christie somewhere near Ladbroke Grove. He told her he had a room, that she could use it. Safe, private, nobody would know. She went with him to Rillington Place. Ethel was away visiting family in Sheffield. The house was empty. What happened in that ground floor flat, in that dim little bedroom with the boarded-up windows, nobody knows exactly. But Ruth First never left. Christie strangled her during sex. He said later, in his confession, that it gave him a thrill like nothing else. The power. The moment when her struggling stopped. He buried her in the garden, under the dirt and the weeds. Ethel came home 3 days later, and noticed nothing. The garden looked the same. Her husband looked the same. Life went on. The second victim came in 1944, Muriel Adey, 32 years old, a co-worker of Ethel's at the factory. She came to tea one afternoon. Christie told her he could help with her bronchitis. He had been a medical orderly during the First World War, he said. He knew about these things. He rigged up a homemade gas apparatus, told her to breathe deeply, that it would clear her lungs. But the gas wasn't medicinal. It was coal gas, mixed with just enough oxygen to keep her conscious, but helpless. When she was weak, unable to fight, he strangled her. Then he buried her next to Ruth in the garden. 2 women under the dirt. 2 women nobody looked for. Muriel's family thought she had run off with a man. The police didn't care. Working-class women disappeared all the time in post-war London. The world had bigger problems. But Christie's hunger wasn't satisfied. He went quiet for 5 years, controlled himself, waited. And then, in 1948, a new family moved into the top-floor flat. A young couple with a baby daughter. Timothy Evans, 24 years old, a van driver. Illiterate, simple, good-hearted in a clumsy way. His wife, Beryl, was 19, pretty, tired, worn down by poverty and motherhood. Their daughter, Geraldine, was 14 months old. They argued constantly. Money, always money. Timothy drank too much. Beryl cried too much. The neighbors heard them shouting through the thin walls almost every night. But they also heard laughter sometimes. They were trying. They were young. Christie met them on the stairs. He introduced himself, offered to help if they ever needed anything. He mentioned, casually, that he used to be a medical man. If Beryl ever had any trouble health-wise, she should come to him. He could probably help. It was cheaper than a doctor. Beryl smiled, grateful. Autumn 1949. The Evans family had been living at Rillington Place for just over a year, and the cracks were showing. Timothy worked long hours loading furniture vans, back-breaking work that paid barely enough to cover rent and food. Beryl stayed home with Geraldine, trapped in 2 cramped rooms with peeling wallpaper and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. She was 19 years old, and she felt 50. The baby cried constantly. The money ran out constantly, and Timothy's temper flared constantly. But the real problem, the one Beryl couldn't say out loud to anyone except her sister, was that she was pregnant again. 3 months gone, and she was terrified. They could barely feed Geraldine. They were already behind on rent. Another baby would finish them. She told Timothy one night after he came home from the pub. He stared at her, the color draining from his face. "What are we going to do?" he asked. She didn't have an answer. There were options, of course, illegal options. In 1949, abortion was a crime in Britain, punishable by life imprisonment. But everyone knew it happened. Backstreet abortionists, women with knitting needles and gin, charging £5 for a procedure that could kill you just as easily as it could save you. Beryl was desperate enough to consider it. She asked around, quietly. A woman at the market gave her a name. But the price was £10. £10? They didn't have 10 shillings. That's when Christie made his move. He had been watching the Evans family, listening through the walls. He heard the arguments. He saw Beryl's face getting thinner, more drawn. He knew desperation when he saw it. One afternoon in early November, he met Beryl on the stairs. She was carrying a basket of laundry, struggling with the weight. He offered to help. She let him. They talked, small talk at first, the weather, the price of bread. Then Christie asked, very gently, if everything was all right. She looked at him with those tired eyes, and something broke. She told him everything, the pregnancy, the fear, the money they didn't have. Christie listened with a concerned, sympathetic expression. Then he told her something that must have sounded like a miracle. He said he could help her. He had medical training, he said. He'd assisted with these procedures before, during the war. It was simple, safe, and he wouldn't charge her anything. He was their neighbor. Neighbors helped each other. Beryl hesitated. She wasn't stupid. She knew it was dangerous. But she was also 19, pregnant, and out of options. She asked if it would hurt. Christie smiled kindly. He said she wouldn't feel a thing. He had a special gas mixture, medical grade. She would go to sleep and wake up, and it would all be over. She agreed. They arranged it for the following week. Timothy would be at work. Geraldine would be with a neighbor who sometimes minded her. Beryl would come down to Christie's flat in the afternoon. Nobody would know. The day came. 8th of November, 1949, a cold, gray Tuesday. Beryl kissed Geraldine goodbye and left her with the neighbor. Timothy had already gone to work. The house was quiet. She walked down the stairs to the ground-floor flat. Christie was waiting. He had set up his apparatus, a jar with rubber tubing leading to a makeshift mask. It looked medical enough, professional. He told her to lie down on the deck chair in the front room. Relax. Breathe normally. He placed the mask over her face. She smelled something sweet, chemical. Her vision blurred. The room tilted. What happened next, Christie described years later in chilling detail. The gas wasn't anesthetic. It was coal gas, the same mixture he had used on Muriel Eady. It didn't knock Beryl unconscious. It paralyzed her. She couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't fight. But she was aware. She knew what was happening when he climbed on top of her. She knew when his hands closed around her throat. She felt herself dying. Christie raped her as he strangled her. Then he dragged her body into the wash house at the back of the building and hid it under some wood. When Timothy came home from work that evening, Beryl wasn't there. Geraldine was still with the neighbor. The flat was empty. He went downstairs and knocked on Christie's door. The older man opened it, calm as anything. Timothy asked if he'd seen Beryl. Christie said yes, actually. She had come down earlier. Said she was going to visit her father in Brighton. She'd seemed upset. She'd left in a hurry. Timothy was confused. Beryl hadn't mentioned Brighton, and she wouldn't leave Geraldine. Christie shrugged. Perhaps she needed time to think. Women get like that sometimes. Timothy should give her a few days. She'd come back. But she didn't come back. Days passed. Timothy went to work, collected Geraldine from the neighbor, tried to manage. He couldn't cook. He couldn't cope. The baby cried constantly. He knocked on Christie's door again, asked if he'd heard anything. Christie said no, but he offered to help. He could ask around. He knew people. Maybe someone had seen her. Timothy thanked him, desperate, grateful. He didn't realize he was talking to the man who had murdered his wife. A week went by. Timothy was falling apart. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. Geraldine wouldn't stop crying. He didn't know how to be a father alone. Christie came upstairs one evening, sat with him, spoke in that soft, reasonable voice. He said he had to be realistic. Beryl had left him. She wasn't coming back. Timothy needed to think about Geraldine. The child needed proper care. Timothy couldn't provide that, not on his own. Christie knew a couple, good people, who couldn't have children of their own. They'd take Geraldine, raise her properly, give her a good life. It would be the kindest thing. Timothy was broken. He believed him. He agreed. Christie said he would arrange everything. A few days later, Christie came back. He said the couple was ready. Geraldine would go to them tonight. It had to be quiet, unofficial. Adoption took time through the proper channels. This way was faster, better. Timothy handed over his daughter, watched Christie carry her down the stairs. He never saw her again. Timothy Evans fled. He couldn't stay in that flat anymore, couldn't bear the silence, the emptiness. He went to Wales, to his mother's house in Merthyr Tydfil. Stayed there for 2 weeks, drinking, barely speaking. His mother knew something was terribly wrong, but he wouldn't tell her what. He barely slept. When he did, he dreamed of Beryl's face, Geraldine's cries. The guilt was eating him alive. On 30th November 1949, Timothy walked into Merthyr Tydfil police station. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His hands were shaking. He told the desk sergeant he needed to report a crime. The sergeant asked what kind of crime. Timothy said murder. He sat in the interview room and told them everything. Except he got it wrong. He told them a story, confused and rambling, that he thought would explain what happened without destroying himself. He said Beryl had died during an abortion. He said a man had come to the flat, offered to help. Something had gone wrong. She had died. He panicked. He didn't know what to do. So he put her body down the drain outside the house. He didn't mention Geraldine. He said she was with the couple Christie had arranged. The police listened. Then they made a phone call to London. Metropolitan Police arrived at Rillington Place on 1st December. They searched the drains. Nothing. They searched the garden. Nothing. Then they searched the wash house behind the building. That's where they found them. Beryl Evans, strangled with a cord, wrapped in a tablecloth. Her baby daughter, Geraldine, strangled with a man's tie, wrapped in a blanket. Both bodies had been there for nearly a month. Timothy was brought back to London immediately, arrested for murder. They put him in a cell and questioned him for hours. He was confused, terrified, illiterate. He couldn't read the statements they put in front of him. He signed them anyway. He changed his story 3 times. First, he said a man had killed her. Then he said it was an accident. Then, exhausted and broken, he said yes, he'd done it. He'd killed her in a rage. They'd been arguing about money. She fell. He strangled her to stop her screaming. Then he killed Geraldine because he couldn't look after her alone. None of it made sense. The method of killing didn't match his story. The position of the bodies didn't match. But the police didn't care. They had a confession. They had a suspect from the lower classes, uneducated, with a history of minor crimes. He fit perfectly. Case closed. And Reginald Christie? He was interviewed, of course, as a witness, as a helpful neighbor. He sat in the police station in his neat tie and spectacles and told them how worried he'd been about the Evans family. All those arguments, the violence. He'd heard Timothy threaten Beryl through the walls. He'd tried to help, but what could he do? Such a tragedy. The police believed every word. Christie was respectable. He'd been a war reserve policeman during the war. He had medical training. He was one of them. Timothy Evans was just another violent working-class thug who'd killed his family. It happened all the time. The trial began on 11th January 1950 at the Old Bailey. Timothy Evans stood in the dock looking lost and frightened, barely understanding what was happening. The prosecution built their case methodically. They presented the bodies. They presented the confession, however confused and contradictory. They presented character witnesses who said Timothy had a temper, that he drank. And then they called Reginald Christie to the stand. Christie was the perfect witness, calm, articulate, sympathetic. He described the Evans family in pitying terms, the constant fighting, the baby crying. He said he'd heard threats. He'd been worried for Beryl's safety. He'd tried to help, but Timothy was too proud to accept charity. The jury looked at Christie and saw a decent man trying to do his best. They looked at Timothy and saw exactly what the prosecution wanted them to see. A brute who'd murdered his wife and child. Timothy's defense was weak. His solicitor tried to argue the confession was unreliable, that Timothy had been confused, coerced. But they had no alternative explanation, no other suspect, no evidence pointing elsewhere. The jury deliberated for 40 minutes. Guilty of murder. The judge sentenced Timothy Evans to death by hanging. On 9th March 1950, Timothy Evans was taken from his cell at Pentonville Prison. He wrote a letter that morning. He could barely write, so a prison chaplain helped him. He said he was innocent. He said he hoped she would believe him. He said he forgave everyone. At 9 o'clock in the morning, they walked him to the execution chamber. The hangman was a man called Albert Pierre Point, Britain's chief executioner. He was efficient, professional. The whole thing took 12 seconds. Timothy Evans died with his neck broken, his body twitching at the end of a rope. He was 25 years old. Reginald Christie read about the execution in the newspapers. He folded the paper carefully and placed it on the table. Then he went about his day. He had won. He had killed 2 people and convinced the state to execute someone else for it. The years following Timothy Evans's execution were quiet ones at Rillington Place. Christie went to work at the post office each day, came home each evening, kept his garden tidy. Nobody suspected a thing. His wife, Ethel, grew older, quieter. She had always been a nervous woman, but now she seemed to fade into the background entirely. She rarely left the house. When neighbors spoke to her in the street, she answered in monosyllables, eyes down, hurrying away. The house itself fell into deeper disrepair. The upstairs flat where the Evans family had lived remained empty for months. Nobody wanted to rent it. There were rumors. People said it was unlucky, cursed. Eventually, a new tenant moved in, a Jamaican immigrant who didn't know the history. He stayed 6 months, then left without explanation. But Christie's hunger hadn't gone away. If anything, it had grown stronger. He had killed 4 times now and gotten away with it completely. He had even managed to make the state kill for him. The power of that, the sheer audacity, was intoxicating. He wanted more. 1952. The king died. George VI, worn out by stress and cigarettes, passed away in February. His daughter Elizabeth became queen. The whole country went into mourning, then celebration. There were street parties for the coronation, bunting and flags, a brief moment of national joy. But in the shabby streets of Notting Hill, life went on as it always had. Poverty, desperation, women selling themselves because it was the only way to eat. Christie found his next victims among them. 3 women in the space of 4 months, all prostitutes, all vulnerable, all invisible. The first was Kathleen Maloney, 26 years old, pregnant. She met Christie in a pub in Ladbroke Grove. He told her he had a room, somewhere warm. She went with him. He used his gas apparatus again, paralyzed her, raped her, strangled her. Then he hid her body in an alcove in the kitchen, behind a false wall he had built. He papered over it. The second was Rita Nelson, 25 years old. She disappeared in January 1953. Same method: gas, rape, strangulation. Her body went into the alcove next to Kathleen's. Christie was running out of space, but he didn't care. The thrill was everything now. He couldn't stop. The third was Hectorina McLennan, 26 years old, Scottish. She disappeared in March. Christie put her body in the alcove with the others. 3 women bricked up in his kitchen wall. And still, nobody noticed. No police came. No questions were asked. These were prostitutes, the dregs of society. Their disappearances barely made the local papers. But Ethel was noticing. She wasn't stupid. She had lived with Christie for 33 years. She knew him. She saw the changes, the locked doors, the strange smells, the nights when he said he was going out for a walk and came back at 3 in the morning. She asked questions. "Where have you been, Reg? What's that smell, Reg? Why is the kitchen wall boarded up, Reg?" Christie realized she was becoming a problem, a risk. She might talk. She might tell someone. And he couldn't have that. On 14th December 1952, whilst the country was still mourning its king, Reginald Christie strangled his wife in her sleep. Ethel Christie, 54 years old, the woman who had stood by him through everything. He told the neighbors she had gone to Sheffield to visit her sister. Nobody questioned it. Ethel was always visiting her sister. Christie stayed in the house for 3 more months, living alone, eating tinned food, the corpses decomposing around him. Under the floor, in the walls, in the garden. The smell was terrible, but he told the neighbors it was blocked drains. They believed him because he was respectable, Mr. Christie. He wouldn't lie. But by March 1953, Christie was falling apart. The control was slipping. He stopped going to work, stopped paying rent. He sublet the flat illegally to a couple who needed somewhere cheap. Then he took what little money he had and disappeared. The new tenants moved in on 20th March. They looked around the filthy flat with disgust. It reeked. The kitchen was particularly bad. The husband, a Jamaican man called Beresford Brown, decided to put up a radio. He wanted to fix it to the wall in the kitchen, near the sink. He tapped the wall. It sounded hollow. He peeled back some wallpaper. There was a cupboard behind it. Except it wasn't a cupboard. It was a hole. And in that hole, wrapped in blankets, was a dead woman. Brown ran outside and vomited. Then he called the police. The police arrived at Rillington Place within the hour. What they found defied belief. 3 bodies in the kitchen alcove, 1 under the floorboards in the parlor, 2 more in the garden, buried years earlier. 6 victims. 6 women murdered and hidden in one small house. The press descended immediately. Photographers, reporters, crowds of horrified onlookers. The whole street was cordoned off. The story was on the front page of every newspaper in Britain. The police wanted Christie. They searched the area, interviewed neighbors, put out descriptions. And then someone remembered Timothy Evans. Remembered that he'd been hanged 3 years earlier for murdering his wife and daughter in this exact same house. The detective in charge of the original investigation was called in. His name was Chief Inspector Jennings. He reviewed the case files, read Christie's witness statements, looked at the evidence, and he realized with cold horror what had happened. They had hanged an innocent man. They had executed Timothy Evans for murders committed by Reginald Christie, the man they had trusted, the man they had put on the witness stand, the man who had helped send Evans to the gallows. The scandal was immediate and explosive. Questions were asked in Parliament. The Home Secretary ordered an urgent review. The newspapers screamed for answers. How could this happen? How could the police get it so catastrophically wrong? But first, they needed to find Christie. He had been on the run for over a week. He had no money, nowhere to go. He was sleeping rough, wandering the streets of London in a filthy overcoat and carpet slippers. He looked like a tramp. On 31st March 1953, a police constable on patrol near Putney Bridge noticed a man leaning over the embankment staring into the Thames. There was something odd about him. The officer approached, asked for identification. The man gave a false name. But the officer wasn't fooled. He'd seen Christie's photograph in the newspapers. Every copper in London had. He arrested Christie on the spot. No struggle, no protest. Christie simply nodded and said, "I knew this would happen eventually." They took him to Notting Hill Police Station, the same station where Timothy Evans had been questioned 3 years before. Christie was placed in an interview room, offered tea. He accepted. Then he confessed to everything. He spoke for hours, calmly, methodically, describing each murder in horrifying detail. How he had killed Ruth and Muriel during the war. How he had killed Beryl Evans when she came to him for help with the abortion. How he had strangled baby Geraldine because she was crying and he couldn't risk the noise. How he had killed the prostitutes. How he had killed his own wife. He showed no remorse, no emotion. He talked about the murders the way someone might describe a day's work. The detectives listened in silence, sickened. When he finished, one of them asked the question everyone was thinking. What about Timothy Evans? Christie paused. Then he said, yes, he'd killed Beryl Evans. He'd lied in court. He'd let an innocent man hang. Why? The detective asked. Christie shrugged. Self-preservation. It was him or me. The trial of Reginald Christie began on 22nd June 1953 at the Old Bailey. The courtroom was packed. The public gallery filled with people who had queued for hours to see the monster in person. Christie stood in the dock, small and pale, blinking behind his spectacles. He looked harmless. That was the most disturbing part. The prosecution presented the evidence, the bodies, the confessions, the timeline. It was overwhelming. But Christie's defense team tried something desperate. They argued insanity, claimed Christie was a sexual psychopath, that he couldn't control himself, that he wasn't responsible for his actions. Medical experts testified. They described his personality disorders, his childhood traumas, his sexual dysfunction. The jury listened. Then they deliberated for 1 hour and 25 minutes. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Christie to death. The whole proceeding took 4 days. On 15th July 1953, Reginald Christie was hanged at Pentonville Prison, the same prison where Timothy Evans had died, the same executioner, Albert Pierpoint, the same rope. Christie walked to the gallows without resistance. His last words were, "I deserve this." The trap opened. His neck broke. He died instantly. But the real reckoning was only beginning. The question now was not who had killed Beryl and Geraldine Evans. It was whether Britain had executed an innocent man, and if so, what that meant for the justice system itself. The government panicked. Within hours of Christie's confession, senior officials at the Home Office were holding emergency meetings. The implications were catastrophic. If Timothy Evans was innocent, then the British justice system had murdered him. Murdered him based on faulty evidence, a weak investigation, and the testimony of the real killer. It was a scandal that could bring down careers, destroy reputations, shake public faith in the courts themselves. The Home Secretary, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, ordered an immediate inquiry, but not a public one. That would be too dangerous, too messy. Instead, he appointed a senior barrister named John Scott Henderson to review the case privately. Henderson was given 3 weeks. His job was clear, though never stated explicitly. Find a way to prove that Evans was still guilty. Save the system, protect the police, preserve the reputation of British justice. Henderson worked quickly. He reviewed the trial transcripts, the evidence, the witness statements. He interviewed police officers, forensic experts, anyone who had been involved in the original case. And then he produced his report. Published on the 13th July, 1953, just 2 days before Christie's execution. The Scott Henderson report concluded that Timothy Evans had indeed murdered his wife and child. that Christie's confession to killing Beryl Evans was false, that Christie had lied to protect his own reputation, to seem more prolific, more dangerous. The report acknowledged that Christie had probably murdered Geraldine, but insisted that Evans had killed Beryl. It was absurd, completely illogical. Why would Evans kill his wife but not his daughter? Why would Christie confess to one murder but not both? The report's reasoning was tortured, contradictory. But it gave the government what it wanted: plausible deniability. The execution of Timothy Evans was ruled lawful and proper. No miscarriage of justice, no apology necessary. Case closed. The public didn't buy it. The newspapers tore the report apart. The Times called it a whitewash. The Daily Mirror ran a front-page headline: "An innocent man was hanged." MPs stood up in Parliament and demanded answers. How could two killers be operating independently in the same house, killing the same family, using the same methods? It was preposterous. The pressure mounted. Questions kept coming. The government stonewalled, refused to reopen the case, insisted the matter was settled. But one person refused to let it die: Timothy Evans's mother, Thomasina Probert. She was a washerwoman from Wales, uneducated, working class. She had watched her son go to the gallows, insisting he was innocent. She had believed him then, she believed him now. She wrote letters, hundreds of them, to MPs, to newspapers, to the Queen herself. She couldn't spell very well. Her handwriting was shaky, but her words were clear. "They killed my boy for nothing. He never hurt nobody. That man Christie done it, and you all know it." Most of her letters were ignored, filed away, forgotten. But some reached sympathetic ears. A young Labour MP named Michael Eddowes became obsessed with the case. He was a lawyer by training, and when he read the Scott Henderson report, he saw immediately what it was: a carefully constructed lie. He began his own investigation, interviewed witnesses the official inquiry had ignored, found inconsistencies in police statements, discovered evidence that had been suppressed. Eddowes wrote a book, published in 1955, "The Man on Your Conscience." It laid out the case methodically, proved beyond any doubt that Timothy Evans had been innocent, that Christie had killed both Beryl and Geraldine, that the police had known the evidence didn't fit, but had pursued Evans anyway because he was an easy target, working class, illiterate, expendable. The book became a bestseller. Public opinion shifted decisively. The government could no longer ignore it. In 1955, a second inquiry was ordered. This time it was chaired by Sir Daniel Braben, a High Court judge. He was given wider powers, more time. The Braben inquiry heard from dozens of witnesses: forensic experts, pathologists, police officers who admitted, finally, that they had doubts at the time, that the confession had seemed forced, that Christie's testimony had felt rehearsed. The inquiry took months. The final report was published in 1966, 13 years after Christie's execution, 16 years after Evans had been hanged. The Braben report concluded what everyone already knew: Timothy Evans had not killed his daughter Geraldine. Christie had. But on the question of Beryl's murder, Braben hedged. He said the evidence was more probable than not that Christie had killed her too, but he couldn't say definitively. It was a politician's answer: careful, non-committal. But it was enough. On 18 October 1966, the Home Secretary granted Timothy Evans a posthumous free pardon. The government acknowledged officially that an innocent man had been executed. Evans's body was exhumed from Pentonville Prison, where it had been buried in an unmarked grave in the prison yard. He was reburied in consecrated ground. His mother attended. She was 73 years old. She stood by the grave and wept. But a pardon wasn't justice. It was an admission of failure. And it came too late. Timothy Evans was still dead. His wife and daughter were still dead. And the system that had killed him remained largely unchanged. Whilst the legal battles raged over Timothy Evans, another question emerged. One that was quieter, less politically explosive, but perhaps more damning. Who were the other victims? Christie had murdered at least 8 women, possibly more. Most of them were never properly mourned, never properly remembered. Because in post-war Britain, some lives mattered less than others. Ruth Fürst, 21 years old, Austrian refugee, nurse and part-time prostitute. She disappeared in August 1943. Did anyone report her missing? No. Her colleagues at the hospital assumed she'd gone back to Austria. Her clients on the street assumed she'd moved to another patch. Nobody investigated. Nobody cared. She was foreign. She was a prostitute. She was nobody. Muriel Evie, 32 years old, factory worker, friend of Ethel Christie. She disappeared in October 1944. Her family did report her missing. The police took a statement, filed it, did nothing. They assumed she'd run off with a man. Women did that sometimes. Why waste resources? She wasn't important enough. Kathleen Maloney, 26 years old, pregnant, prostitute, disappeared in January 1953. No missing persons report, no investigation. Nobody noticed she was gone, except perhaps her pimp, and he certainly wasn't going to the police. Rita Nelson, 25 years old, disappeared weeks later. Same story. No report, no investigation. Invisible. Hectorina McLennan, 26 years old, Scottish. She was actually reported missing by her boyfriend. He went to the police frantic. They told him she'd probably gone back to Scotland, told him to stop wasting their time. He insisted something was wrong. They threw him out. 3 weeks later, they found her body bricked up in Christie's kitchen. These women were killed not just by Reginald Christie, but by a society that deemed them worthless. The police could have found them, could have investigated, could have connected the disappearances. All the victims lived within a 2-mile radius of Rillington Place. All disappeared within a 10-year period. All were vulnerable women from the margins of society. The pattern was there, but nobody looked. Because in 1940s and 50s Britain, certain women were expendable. Prostitutes, single mothers, immigrants, working-class women who lived rough, who made bad choices, who fell through the cracks. If they disappeared, well, that was their own fault, wasn't it? They'd probably just moved on. Why would the police waste time on them when there were real crimes to solve? This attitude was explicit in police culture at the time. A retired detective who worked in Notting Hill during that era was interviewed years later. He said, off the record, that they had a saying, "If she's on the game, she's fair game," meaning prostitutes were acceptable victims. Their deaths didn't really count. They'd taken risks. They'd made themselves vulnerable. It was practically their own fault. The newspapers at the time barely mentioned Christie's victims by name. They were the bodies, the victims, anonymous, reduced to statistics. The coverage focused on Christie himself, his psychology, his methods. The women he killed were just props in his story, background characters. Their lives, their hopes, their families didn't matter. Only one victim got sustained attention, Beryl Evans, and that was only because her murder had resulted in a wrongful execution. Beryl mattered because Timothy mattered, because his case embarrassed the government. But the others? Ruth, Muriel, Kathleen, Rita, Hectorina? They were forgotten almost immediately. Ethel Christie, Reginald's wife, was treated somewhat differently. She was pitied. The poor woman married to a monster. She hadn't known what he was, the newspapers said. She was his victim too. But even that narrative was false. Ethel almost certainly knew. How could she not? She lived in that house for years whilst bodies decomposed under the floorboards, in the garden, behind the walls. She must have smelled it, must have noticed the locked doors, the odd behavior. But she was trapped, financially dependent, frightened. And by the time she worked up the courage to say something, he killed her. The Rillington Plinth case revealed something ugly about British society. It showed that the law didn't protect everyone equally, that some victims were worth investigating and others weren't, that class, gender, and social status determined whether your death would be treated as a tragedy or just another statistic. And that truth was far more uncomfortable than the story of one serial killer. The execution of Timothy Evans became a rallying cry. For years, campaigners had argued against the death penalty on moral grounds. They said it was barbaric, that it didn't deter crime, that a civilized society shouldn't kill its own citizens. But the arguments had fallen on deaf ears. The British public supported hanging. Politicians supported hanging. The system worked, they said. Murderers deserved to die. Then came Rillington Place. Here was proof, undeniable and horrifying, that the system didn't work, that innocent people could be hanged, that evidence could be wrong, confessions could be false, witnesses could lie, that judges and juries, despite their best intentions, could make catastrophic mistakes. And those mistakes were irreversible. You couldn't bring Timothy Evans back. You couldn't undo his execution. He was gone forever. The case changed the debate entirely. It wasn't about morality anymore. It was about practicality. If even one innocent person could be executed, then capital punishment was too dangerous to use. The risk was unacceptable. MPs who had supported hanging for years began to waver. Public opinion shifted. Opinion polls showed a dramatic drop in support for the death penalty, particularly among younger people. In 1957, the Homicide Act was passed. It restricted the death penalty to specific categories of murder: killing a police officer, killing during a robbery, killing with a firearm. Most murders were now punishable by life imprisonment instead. It was a compromise, an attempt to limit the damage whilst keeping hanging for the worst cases. But it didn't satisfy anyone. The abolitionists pushed harder. They pointed to studies showing that the murder rate hadn't increased in countries that had abolished the death penalty. They pointed to cases like Derek Bentley, another young man executed in 1953 for a crime he probably didn't commit. They pointed, always, to Timothy Evans. In 1965, Parliament voted to suspend the death penalty for 5 years. It was a trial period. If the murder rate didn't explode, the suspension would become permanent. The Home Secretary at the time, Roy Jenkins, was a committed abolitionist. He pushed the legislation through despite significant opposition. The last executions in Britain took place on 13 August 1964. 2 men, Peter Allen and Gwyn Evans, hanged simultaneously in different prisons for murdering a man during a robbery. The hangman was once again Albert Pierpoint. He retired shortly afterwards, said he'd lost faith in what he was doing. The 5-year trial period passed. The murder rate didn't rise. If anything, it fell slightly. In December 1969, Parliament voted to make the abolition permanent. The death penalty was gone. Britain would never execute another prisoner. The noose, the trapdoor, the quick drop and sudden stop, all relegated to history. Rillington Place wasn't the only reason capital punishment was abolished, but it was the catalyst. It was the case that made abolition politically possible. Timothy Evans, the barely literate van driver who died insisting he was innocent, became the symbol of everything wrong with judicial killing. His face appeared on posters, in pamphlets, in parliamentary debates. His story was told and retold, a cautionary tale about the fallibility of justice. In a bitter irony, Timothy Evans achieved more in death than he ever could have in life. His execution saved countless others. How many innocent people would have been hanged if the system had continued? We'll never know. But because of what happened to him, because of the scandal that followed, those executions never took place. Number 10 Rillington Place became the most infamous address in Britain. After Christie's arrest, the house was sealed off as a crime scene. Police forensic teams spent weeks there, tearing up floorboards, digging up the garden, dismantling walls. They photographed everything, catalogued every piece of evidence. The pictures were never released to the public. They were too disturbing. But people wanted to see. The morbidly curious descended on Rillington Place in their hundreds. They stood outside the police cordon, staring at the grimy Victorian terrace, trying to imagine the horrors that had occurred inside. Vendors set up stalls selling tea and sandwiches. It became a macabre tourist attraction, a destination for Sunday outings. Families brought their children, pointed at the house, told them stories. The other residents of Rillington Place hated it. They couldn't sleep for the noise, couldn't leave their homes without reporters shoving cameras in their faces, asking how it felt to live next door to a serial killer. Property values collapsed. Nobody wanted to buy there, nobody wanted to rent. The street became a ghetto overnight. The house itself remained empty for months. Nobody would touch it. There were stories that it was haunted, that you could hear screams at night, that Christie's ghost walked the halls. All nonsense, of course, but the stigma was real. Eventually, the local council made a decision. The house had to go. It was too damaged, too infamous. It would never be livable again. In 1970, number 10 Rillington Place was demolished. Not just the house, the entire street. Every building torn down, the rubble carted away. The council built a new road in its place. They even changed the name. Rillington Place ceased to exist. It became Ruston Close, an attempt to erase the past, to let people forget. But the house lived on in other ways. It became the subject of books, films, documentaries. In 1971, a film called 10 Rillington Place was released, starring Richard Attenborough as Christie. It was disturbing, bleak, unflinching. Attenborough's performance was chilling. He made Christie human, which somehow made him more monstrous. The film was a hit, but it was also controversial. Critics argued it glorified murder, that it turned real tragedy into entertainment. The families of the victims hated it. They said it reopened wounds that had never properly healed. Over the decades, the case became a fixture in true crime literature. Every few years, a new book would appear, claiming to reveal fresh evidence, to answer lingering questions. Did Christie have other victims? There were rumors. Unsolved disappearances in the Notting Hill area during the 1940s. Women who vanished and were never found. But no proof. No bodies. Just suspicions. One question that haunted investigators: what happened to the abortion Christie was supposedly performing on Beryl Evans? Was he even capable of performing an abortion? Probably not. He had worked as a medical orderly, but that didn't qualify him to perform surgery. More likely, he had lured Beryl to his flat under false pretenses. The abortion was bait, a way to get her alone, vulnerable, trusting. And then he had killed her. Another question: did Ethel Christie really not know? For years, the official story was that she was an innocent victim. But some investigators disagreed. They pointed to the timeline. Ethel was home when Christie killed Muriel Eady. She was in the house. How could she not have known? And later, when bodies were bricked up in the walls, when the smell must have been overwhelming, how could she not have noticed? One theory suggests she did know, or at least suspected, but was too terrified to act. Another suggests she was complicit, that she helped dispose of bodies, that she was part of it. The truth died with her. The case also raised questions about police competence. How had they missed so much evidence during the Evans investigation? How had they failed to search properly? The wash house where Beryl and Geraldine's bodies were found had been searched, or so the police claimed. But they'd missed 2 corpses wrapped in bedding. Later, it emerged that the search had been cursory at best. Officers had opened the door, glanced inside, and moved on. They weren't looking for bodies. They were looking for evidence to support Evans's confession. Confirmation bias. They saw what they expected to see. 70 years have passed since Reginald Christie was hanged. 70 years since Timothy Evans was posthumously pardoned. The house is long gone. The street renamed. Most of the people involved are dead. But the case endures. It endures because it tells us something fundamental about justice, about class, about the value we place on human life. Timothy Evans was failed by every institution that should have protected him. The police didn't investigate properly. His lawyers didn't defend him adequately. The jury didn't look past their prejudices. The judge didn't question the inconsistencies. The appeals system didn't catch the error. And the government, when faced with evidence of a wrongful execution, tried to cover it up rather than admit fault. Evans was failed because he was poor, because he was uneducated, because he didn't matter to the people in power. The women Christie killed were failed for similar reasons. They were prostitutes, immigrants, working class. Their disappearances weren't priorities. Their lives weren't valued. If Christie had been targeting middle-class women, women from respectable families, the police would have acted sooner. But he chose his victims carefully. He knew which women he could kill without consequence. The case transformed British criminal justice in several ways. It led directly to the abolition of capital punishment, saving countless lives. It led to reforms in how police conduct investigations, particularly around confessions. It led to greater scrutiny of forensic evidence. It made wrongful convictions a matter of public concern rather than an abstract possibility. But some things haven't changed. Class still matters. Wealth still matters. Vulnerable people are still more likely to be victims and less likely to get justice. The mechanisms have evolved, but the fundamental inequalities remain. In 2003, 50 years after Christie's execution, a memorial was unveiled at the site where Rillington Place once stood. A small plaque, easy to miss. It lists the names of Christie's victims: Ruth Fuerst, Muriel Eady, Beryl Evans, Geraldine Evans, Ethel Christie, Kathleen Maloney, Rita Nelson, Hectorina McLennan. 8 women. 8 lives cut short. The plaque was vandalized within a week. Someone spray-painted over it. The council cleaned it, but it happened again. Eventually, they removed it altogether. Even in death, the victims of Rillington Place couldn't find peace. Timothy Evans's name appears in law textbooks now, in lectures on wrongful convictions, in arguments about the death penalty. He has become a symbol, which is ironic. In life, he was nobody, a face in the crowd, forgettable. But in death, he changed history. His execution haunted a generation of politicians, lawyers, and judges. It forced Britain to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the justice system, for all its pomp and ceremony, could get things catastrophically wrong. There's a final, chilling detail. Albert Pierpoint, the executioner who hanged both Christie and Evans, later became an opponent of capital punishment. He wrote in his memoir that executing people had achieved nothing, that he had hung hundreds of men and women, and it had never deterred a single murder. He had come to believe that the death penalty was pointless, vengeful, and morally wrong. The man who had operated the gallows for 25 years, who had perfected the art of judicial killing, ended his life arguing for abolition. He had a particular regret: Timothy Evans. Pierpoint remembered him clearly. A young man, frightened but resigned. He had walked to the gallows quietly, hadn't struggled, hadn't protested, just accepted his fate. Pierpoint said later that Evans's execution had troubled him more than any other, because even at the time he'd sensed something was wrong. The man didn't act like a killer, but it wasn't his job to question. His job was to hang them, and so he had. 3 years later, he hanged Reginald Christie. Same prison, same apparatus, same method. He looked into Christie's face and saw guilt there, real, unmistakable guilt. And he understood what had happened, that he had killed an innocent man, that the state had used him to commit murder. The realization destroyed him. The case of Rillington Place remains one of the darkest chapters in British legal history, a perfect storm of incompetence, prejudice, and injustice. It shows what happens when society decides that some lives matter less than others, when police take shortcuts, when lawyers don't fight hard enough, when juries judge based on class rather than evidence, when governments prioritize reputation over truth. The house is gone, the street is gone, the people are gone, but the lessons remain. Justice is fragile. The innocent can be condemned. The guilty can walk free. And once the trap drops, once the rope tightens, there is no going back. Timothy Evans was 25 when he died. He left behind a mother who spent the rest of her life fighting to clear his name. He left behind a legacy that changed a nation's laws. And he left behind a question that haunts us still. How many others? How many innocent people died on the gallows before we finally learned? We will never know. And that, perhaps, is the most horrifying truth of all.